All right, it's the top of the hour, and let's get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the GMC October membership meeting. I'm Greg Marcus, chair of the GMC and president and CEO of Marcus Corporation. This is the last GMC membership meeting of 2021, and we're taking this opportunity to go a little deeper into a topic that I've been personally interested in, the impact of social isolation. Social isolation is something that our world has experienced for decades. From technology advances to the forced isolation of the pandemic, it's easy to believe our entire society has experienced a level of social isolation. Perhaps you saw the piece I wrote a few weeks ago for the Business Journal. The thrust of my discussion was on the societal benefits of going back to work. It starts with the concept of social trust. Social trust being the idea that although we as citizens disagree, we still trust one another. And the more we trust one another, the better we perform as a community on measures like growth, health, and crime. Think about the impact of trust on vaccination. It's the most often cited reason for not getting vaccinated, lack of trust. This didn't happen overnight. Levels of social trust have been in decline for decades, and that is a result of observable declines in connectivity. In other words, we're around one another less often. Well, the pandemic has accelerated this trend. And now the idea that we are going to do everything alone from home further reduces our connectivity and thus our trust. But being at home alone has even more potential for negative impact. Being isolated can't be good psychologically, and I won't be surprised if we see increases in substance abuse issues. It's one thing to have a drink in the morning and show up to the office where you're around others. It's quite another to do it at home alone where no one can see you. Today's guest speakers are going to touch on the many aspects of social isolation and how it is impacting people individually and as a community. But before we hear from them, I invite Dr. Raymond to provide his monthly COVID update, hopefully giving us a glimmer of the end of pandemic-induced isolation. Welcome, Dr. John Raymond, President and CEO of the Medical College of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Greg, and I hate to disappoint you, but the news is some good and some not so good. So why don't we go ahead and go to the first slide, please, Heather? Thank you. Next slide. Just want to put things into context before we start. Worldwide, global cases of COVID-19 have hit 250 million with over 5 million deaths. And in the US, we've had 47 million cases and about 772,000 deaths. In the US, we've had 223 million people receive at least one dose of an authorized COVID-19 vaccine. That's 68% of the population. And 193 million, or 59%, have completed the full course. A lot of activity recently. It's actually getting challenging to keep up with all of the emergency use authorization requests and the authorizations and approvals. But most of us know now that boosters for all three COVID-19 vaccines have been authorized in the US. Under emergency use authorization, children 5 to 11 are eligible to receive the Pfizer vaccine. And there's a lot of activity with oral antiviral or repurposed drugs to either treat or prevent COVID-19, including Paxlovid, which is a drug from Pfizer, molnupiravir, which is a drug from Merck, both of which have promise for early treatment of mildly symptomatic COVID-19 disease, and new data showing that the Regeneron antibody treatment, when given subcutaneously, can actually confer very significant immunity for up to 6 months, and really relatively high numbers, 81%. On the other hand, some cautionary notes. About a third of our states have stalled in the downward trend of COVID-19, and some even appear to be seeing an uptick in cases. And again, we always look to Europe to maybe see a month down the road for us because they tend to be ahead of us. And Europe has seen a jump of more than 50% in new cases, some of which is happening in countries that actually had COVID-19 relatively well under control just a month ago. But the majority of it is in poorly vaccinated countries, especially in Eastern Europe. So again, just a cautionary note, looking at Europe, the downward trend has stopped. There's a plateau in some parts of Europe. And this is coinciding with a relaxation of public health and individual mitigation measures. So we shouldn't declare victory prematurely. And this is maybe a recipe for a lingering Delta surge, or if things go poorly, even another surge. So let's turn to Wisconsin's numbers. And these are higher than they have been for the last 3 to 4 weeks, unfortunately. Our 7-day average of new daily cases is trending unfavorably or upward. The average is over 2,000 now. The case positivity had been down in the 7% range, and unfortunately, it also is trending unfavorably at 8.6%, and the reproductive number is at 1.1. We're kind of in the middle of the pack compared to the rest of the states in terms of our new daily case counts. Our 14-day average is flat. It's only down 2%, not as good as we were seeing a few weeks ago, and we're the 30th best state. And in terms of hospitalizations, continuing downward or favorable trend, but this seems to be slowing, and now we're in the middle of the pack at the 26th best state with a 10% reduction over the last 2 weeks. And we are clearly in the middle of the pack in terms of vaccinations at 59% fully vaccinated. Now, I do want to place some caveats on these numbers. Most of these numbers are from last Friday, and the numbers that come out on Monday and Tuesday tend to have some lag over the weekend, and we don't get numbers reported in Wisconsin over the weekend anymore. So the Wednesday numbers are going to be really critical for determining whether we're going to have continuing progress or whether we've reached sort of a static phase in the pandemic. Next slide, please. Thanks, Heather. Average daily deaths have been stable in the low single digits for the last 6 weeks, and our 7-day average is 13. Hospitalizations continue to trend favorably, but not as rapid a decline in hospitalizations as we were seeing a few weeks ago. There are 947 people in Wisconsin hospitals, or there were as of Friday, with COVID-19, 252 in the ICUs. Fortunately, that trend is favorable and seems to be continuing to be favorable. Our occupancy rates are quite high, but trending favorably for intensive care units. We were up over 95% a couple of weeks ago, and we're at 91%. And our overall hospital utilization remains very high at 91%, and that is flat. And the ICU census here in southeastern Wisconsin continues to trend favorably. We have 116 people in ICUs as of last Friday. Next slide, please. Again, this is a picture that I've shown multiple times in the past, showing the case burden trends in our 72 counties over time, starting a year ago. Red is bad, dark blue is almost as bad. And you can see starting at the left, last November, we were in fairly bad shape in terms of COVID-19 case burdens in our counties. When we started to vaccinate people in December and January, we saw a significant decline in the case burdens, as you can see second from the left. That trend continued to be very, very favorable all the way through June and the first week of July, with relatively low case burdens in a majority of our counties, but then the Delta surge hit us. What you see on the right are data from last Wednesday showing that we still have 3 counties that are high, and Milwaukee's one of those. Dane is another, and you can see that with the circle on the lower right, which is good compared to other counties. 4 critically high and the remaining high. So though our trajectory has been trending favorably now for a month or more, we still have a very high case burden. And even in Milwaukee, where we're faring better than the rest of the state, the case burden remains high at over 300 cases per 100,000 diagnosed in the previous 2 weeks. So when you think about your personal mitigation measures, getting together for the holidays, return to work, one variable that I think people need to consider that isn't discussed very frequently is the burden of disease in your community as well as the trajectory. So again, the numbers we're going to see this Wednesday will be very telling for us. Next slide, please. Okay, just in the US, things in general have been going well. We're in the middle of the fourth or fifth wave, and we've seen significant decreases in the US for the last 6 weeks, but the decrease has clearly slowed down with, as I mentioned, about a dozen or so states seeing increases in their case counts, and that's new. Daily case counts, though, on average have declined to under 72,000. But again, very slow decrease, only 2% over the last 14 days. Hospitalizations continue to decrease with 47,000 in hospital. And these numbers are as of yesterday. And we had peaked at over 100,000, with hospitalizations decreasing by 14% over the last 14 days. That's pretty good, but not as good as we were seeing in the previous month. Deaths also are creeping downward now to over 1,000 per day at 1,220, and we peaked at over 2,000. Now, Wisconsin still continues to have very high case burden, average of 530 per 100,000. And as I mentioned, in Milwaukee County, we're a little over 300, so doing better than most of the rest of the state, and our hospitals are full. Next slide, please. These are numbers that we've already talked about, but you can see the trends here over time. We kind of have plateaued with our new cases, maybe an uptick. We'll know more on Wednesday. That's on the upper left. And then on the upper right, you can see that we still have a high positivity rate. You want to see that be significantly below 5%. Next slide, please. All right, just want to talk about therapeutics. I know that we're all eager for an inexpensive, widely available, perhaps repurposed medication that can help with COVID-19. I want to remind everybody, especially in the midst of the highly politicized and fragmented conversations about hydroxychloroquine, zinc, azithromycin, and ivermectin, that the medical establishment would love to have an inexpensive repurposed medicine. In fact, we're already using one. Dexamethasone, which is used to prevent cytokine storm, is inexpensive and is available in every hospital in the US. That's used to treat people to try to prevent a transition from moderate to severe COVID-19 disease. A lot of activity with monoclonal antibodies. I mentioned the promising data that were released this morning about Regeneron as perhaps a prophylactic treatment for people that can't mount an immune response, say cancer patients. So that's very promising. There is a new monoclonal antibody treatment from AstraZeneca that seems to be even more effective than the Regeneron and Lilly products that are already authorized under EUA. And we should hear more about that from the FDA and the CDC in the coming month. Remdesivir is a repurposed drug that seems to work modestly for people with moderate disease. And some really interesting new findings for fluvoxamine, which is an antidepressant serotonin reuptake inhibitor that has known anti-inflammatory effects. And in preliminary studies, seems to be modestly effective in preventing hospitalizations and severe disease. And before people become advocates, start asking their doctors for this. This is early in the scientific process. And again, we don't want to repeat the mistakes we made with hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin by advocating prematurely. The process is playing out. And as most of you already know, there are two pills that appear to be incredibly promising in early COVID-19 disease: molnupiravir, which is a polymerase inhibitor from Merck and Ridgeback. Preliminary data on a couple of thousand patients suggests a 50% reduction in hospitalizations and death. November 30th is a key date for the FDA Advisory Committee to review those data and the request for EUA. And I expect Pfizer to be submitting a similar emergency use authorization request for Paxlovid, which is a protease inhibitor that appears to reduce hospitalizations and death by 90%. But this was on a very small number of patients, a little over 700. So more data needs to be accumulated, but it looks like we're making some significant progress in terms of therapeutics. Next slide, please. And I just want to say, if people want to download the handout, MCW and our partners have tried to put together some talking points about information for parents, considering whether they want to have kids 5 to 11 or 12 to 17 vaccinated. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Greg. or Julia.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. Raymond, for both the sobering update plus some potential good news on the therapeutics. I think it's also great news that children between the ages of 5 and 11 are now eligible for the Pfizer vaccine. It's another step to recovery and safety. So let's talk a little bit about the GMC updates for economic prosperity. Recently, the Wisconsin Policy Forum released a report titled Up to Speed, which takes an in-depth look at the technology usage and gaps by small businesses in Milwaukee. The GMC commissioned this report at the beginning of the pandemic. We were very interested in the impact of the pandemic on small businesses that were served by Scale Up Milwaukee and the collaborative Brew City Match program as a part of Milwaukee United. So we particularly wanted a comparison of the small businesses of color. How were these businesses experiencing and dealing with the numerous resource gaps due to the pandemic? If you read the report, there's a lot of interesting pieces in there about how much of it varied by the age of the individuals that were involved, but also there was certainly a lot of gaps due to digital resources. During the pandemic, 2 new cohorts of Spark and the Growth Accelerator provided access to more digital resources to help these small businesses sustain and grow their businesses. Urge you to read the report. It's very interesting. We don't really have a broadband access in Milwaukee, but we do have a Wi-Fi access. For Vibrancy of Place, we have more news on the Beer Line Trail Neighborhood Development Project. Walter Hood, who's the urban landscape designer for the Trails Linear Park, recently won an award for excellence for his book Black Landscapes Matter through the American Society of Landscape Architects. Beer Line Trail partner Sarah DeLeiden of MKE LAX also has a chapter in this book, so we want to congratulate both Walter and Sarah, but also Riverworks and the project team who are working on the development of the Beer Line Trail activities and development. Let's go to innovation and talent. The Commons has spent the last 8 years crafting hands-on experiential learning experiences that parks basically spark an innovation mindset, build meaningful connections, and strengthen community engagement. As they develop the next steps for their work, they're exploring how their processes can be leveraged as a civic innovation resource for the public and nonprofit sectors. Our team is conducting a focus group around a new idea to address strategic civic innovation called the Milwaukee Impact Lab. The Impact Lab is testing a sustainable and replicable approach to address key social issues by utilizing best practices in facilitated design thinking and corporate innovation tactics. So we invite you to join the Commons on Monday, November 22nd for the opportunity to provide input for the Milwaukee Impact Lab. The team will incorporate themes of mental health as a part of this discussion, partially inspired by last month and this month's GMC meetings. And we welcome all interested members who are interested in innovative thinking to join the focus group. We will email a link to register to all members, or you can contact Maggie or Heather at the GMC. And now I'd like to introduce today's first guest speaker, Jeremy Froedtert, to talk about how Milwaukee and the newly created Likeminded are addressing social isolation by fostering community through innovative software. Jeremy is co-founder and chief idea officer with Milwaukee and the CEO of Likeminded. He spent the last decade applying unique approaches to complex problems to increase engagement, economic development, and awareness for businesses, neighborhoods, and organizations. The GMC has enjoyed working with Jeremy on a variety of talent, economic, and community development projects throughout the years, including CoLab and the Night Market. So welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks, Julia. Appreciate it. Thanks everyone for having me again. My name is Jeremy. Obviously co-founded Milwaukee, also co-founded, I'm a serial entrepreneur here in Milwaukee, if you don't know me. Co-founded 3 years ago another company called Nuance, which is a tech recruitment firm. And now I'm working on this project Likeminded, which is a new company around facilitating human connection through intelligent match technology. And that technology really is at the precipice of a social isolation and loneliness. And that's kind of why I'm here today. And if you want to go to the next slide, Heather, what we realized was there's a large opportunity to solve problems of disconnection within many different verticals. One of those verticals being corporations, and how especially people are seeing it now of the connection between employees and why people are leaving. The connection between students and campuses. Senior living is another vertical we think we can play in. And then obviously any type of apartment or membership organizations. And we started building this, if you want to go to the next slide, because this social isolation impacts all of us, and it has a real bottom line. What we found is 61% of Americans, said they were lonely or social isolated, and that was pre-COVID. Those disconnected and lonely people are 2 times more likely to quit. We know the costs are huge when someone leaves, and they only continue to grow. And lonely employers are more disengaged, and people don't tell you that they're lonely or they're isolated. And we thought at Likeminded, how do we scale human connection kind of on an enterprise scale? So we started looking at reasons why we're lonely. And a lot of it I thought actually was going to be an improvement when we went to remote work, because we didn't have to commute anymore. The way we design our cities, the way we've actually designed ourselves out of micro interactions, the way we've got everything delivered instead of having those interactions anymore. And the fact that we're always on and never off in our job has kind of led to this need now to be connected to where we meet people. About 67% of people meet their friends at work. You can see that if we're not connecting, how we could become more lonely. And, we typically say, the older people are, the more isolated they could be, but it actually is kind of the opposite. Gen Z is one of the loneliest generations, and people under about 25, 26. And so if you go to the next slide, Heather, we kind of started thinking about, what's the future of workplace connection? And we started thinking about that cliche of, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it really fall? And the same thing can be true now. If I don't get to know my coworker or connect with my coworker in this remote hybrid work environment, do I really work with them? What does that connection look like? And I think the future of workplace connection is going to be about knowing people as a person and the human identity of them and their mental and physical health, which we've always placed a large emphasis on physical health in all the different programs at our companies. But now mental health and connection are going to be ever so important. And I think it's about customizing work plans to those individuals. Some people will not excel at remote work. Some people will not. But what we really see in the future of the workplace is the rise of communities at a record pace. And those can be online communities, that can be in-person communities. You see the rise in crypto communities, the meta universe, NFTs, meme stocks. All these things are about people coming together. But now, and if you can see a lot of companies on the coast they have chief community officers. They're looking at building internal community in their companies. And we kind of thought there's something there. But what is there? If you go to the next slide, we found myself, Angela from Milwaukee, but me and Ben are working on this day to day now. Ben Juarez was at Northwestern Mutual, now is part of my team. And we bumped into Galen, who created the eHarmony algorithm, and started thinking about friendship. And through our research, we found that people that form a friendship inside a company stay longer, they're happier, they're more connected, they're more engaged. So we thought, how do we build an algorithm around friendship? So if you go to the next slide here, how do we create that kind of deliberate serendipity, not just serendipity in the workplace? So we started uncovering patterns that are in friendship. Just some patterns like the majority of friends are within 7 years of age apart and 7 miles from each other still in this day. And, still that we are connected online, we're still kind of coming to closeness as an important element in friendship. And people that aren't connected, they can see the rise. We see the rise in depression right now. We see the rise in disengagement. And we're also, I think Greg pointed out at the beginning, we've seen a rise in divisiveness. And to go back on the importance of friendship, there have been so many studies around friendship and how important it is, but how much we take it for granted and we leave so much to chance. So how Likeminded works to kind of help out here is we give employees right now an assessment, and I'll show you how we're working with some companies and some universities. And based on that assessment, we take into consideration their personality, their life stage, their interests, and their identities, and we start to connect people. If you go to the next slide. So we start to connect people inside the companies. And inside those companies, people get kind of the about them back to them. So they get their information, so they get their archetype back best and their personality. And this is important so people learn a little bit more about themselves. You can go to the next slide. But they also get to learn about how they communicate with others. So when people take the Likeminded assessment, they get matched with inside the company to other people that they would find a connection to. Statistically, we change our friendship groups about every 7 years by about 47%. We found that relationship deteriorate about 20% if you don't communicate in 90 days. And we found out it takes about 60 to 90 hours to turn an acquaintance into a meaningful connection. So we introduce people based on their, what we call feathers, their high intensity points of interest. And then we give people a way to communicate with each other so they can meet, have coffee, connect across silos, and make sure, and, connect people with friends inside the company. And where that goes, is really important. There's a reason why startups can topple large corporations. It's because the relationship they're forming a startup have deep friendship. Go to the next slide. And we've tested this in over a couple thousand people now, and we have 94% of the people that we have given this assessment to and matched have said they're extremely likely to meet again. And that's pretty big. That's huge for people that might just start at your companies and say, how do I connect to somebody here? How do I create better social capital for myself and the company? How do I find out like I can belong here? So we match them based on that. If you can go to the next slide. And so we launched this product in July of 2021. So we are still really new. We have 15 pilots going right now, a couple more coming on board. We've, after our beta, have done 945 assessments and made 2,000 connections so far in this kind of MVP stage. You can go to the next slide. And here are some of the organizations and companies piloting, and here are some of the other ones we're talking to. So you can see, some of the organizations like the city of Cleveland, Lincoln, Nebraska, and a couple other economic development associations. But you can see there's some universities in here. We're doing a really cool study with Marquette right now. Advocate Aurora in the new year will start in January. Northwestern Mutual starts pretty soon, and then Manpower as well. You can see some of these companies are piloting our software because they realize that connection is extremely important than some of the other companies on the right that we're in conversations with right now. Go to the next slide. So, what we've found so far in early stages of piloting the software is we've had people become new roommates that have met through this software. We've had people form a new company. We've had people find new employees. We've had people that have become friends. Obviously, that's the whole goal of this, as a friendship algorithm, and create new networks and groups. When a company moves people into a new city, it's one of the most lonely times because of that life stage transition. Or when someone goes to school, it's a huge life stage transition. So what we've also found is that if we can introduce people to 3 positive connections where they have a good relationship with, we can increase the feeling of belonging inside that company. Now, this is really early data. We also have found a dip in social isolation by connecting people within the first 90 days of starting the company and how they feel. And this is compared to people that didn't take the assessment, comparable to people that have. You can go to the next slide. So employees are craving connection, and that's what we're giving them. We've also found out how people can deal with different types of work environments. Instead of saying it's a one size fit all, like we're going to be remote, we're going to be hybrid, or we're going to be in the office, we can actually, through this assessment, kind of dictate or predict how people will handle working from home, how people handle high stress environments, how people might be motivated, and how people might be a threat to teamwork or something like that. So this is kind of we create almost a personal user manual of someone's self, and that's how we connect people. You can go to the next slide. So, this is what we're building. Like I said, we're an early startup. We're looking for pilots right now. We're seeing a lot of good results. I think the future, this could be a good tool. And friendship is one of the most important things, and how we connect people and their layers of friendship, and especially when it comes to companies. I mean, that's where we are right now. So I thank everybody for their time. If you have any questions, here's my email. I'm on LinkedIn, and you can kind of connect there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. The importance of connection in the workplace does so much more for our community than we could ever imagine. We look forward to hearing updates from your pilot programs in the future.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to introduce today's keynote and panelists addressing the impact of social isolation. We will first hear from Bethany Lopresti, Executive Director of Behavioral Health at Froedtert and the Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychiatry for the Medical College of Wisconsin. Bethany will share an overview of social isolation and how it has evolved over past, present, and future. Following Bethany, she will be joined by experts in social isolation to discuss how it is impacting our society on many levels. Dr. Mark Money, Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, will moderate the panel. Guests include Amy Herbst, Vice President for Mental and Behavioral Health, Children's Wisconsin. Dr. Munder Barakat, Director of Behavioral Health Therapy at Aurora Psychiatric Hospital, Advocate Aurora Health. Dr. Kenneth Johnson, Medical Director for Ascension, Wisconsin Behavior Medicine. Similar to last month, GMC will share mental health resources with our membership if you would like to chat with a professional after today's meeting. The Q&A box is open to submit your questions. And due to the sensitive nature of today's topic, you can submit questions anonymously. The chat is also open to comment publicly. We're also interested in learning what each of you are doing to address mental health and social isolation in your workplace. Share those things with us by emailing them to Heather at the GMC. And now I welcome Bethany.
Thanks so much, Greg, and thank you all for having me today and for bringing this very important topic to light. I think it's going to be a great discussion today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of lay some groundwork for social isolation and what we know about its effects. Although I know it's becoming familiar to all of us, I wanted to start with the definition of social isolation, particularly because it's easy to confuse social isolation with loneliness. And so, while the two are closely interrelated, social isolation is really the state of being in the absence of your social networks, while loneliness is more the feeling of being alone or separated from others. Loneliness tends to be a little bit more subjective. So, for example, we can live alone and not feel lonely, feel quite satisfied. We've also probably all had the experience of feeling rather lonely while we're in a crowd or in the presence of other people. So loneliness is really considered the psychological embodiment of social isolation. And, for many of us over the past 20 months, our experiences really have included both social isolation and loneliness. So as we can advance to the next slide, Heather. And, when we start by asking this question, do we really need social connection? The short answer to that, of course, is yes. As social beings, we are genetically hardwired to want to connect with others. And so when we don't, we see a host of negative effects. And I have listed some here. This is all coming from research on both individuals, from childhood through the life stages, as well as small groups of people. We've even got research from groups of researchers on the space station, for example. You can be in a small group and still experiencing social isolation, as many of us know if we've been home with our families over the last 20 months. All of these negative effects are intensified by stress. So when we look at the situation that we've all been in over the last 20 months, some of the important considerations that we have to factor in here are the fear associated with the pandemic and the stress that that has caused, as well as the lack of control over the type of social isolation and loneliness that we've been experiencing. It's very important for us as human beings to feel like we're in control of our environment. So this type of social isolation is very different than the type of isolation that we might experience if we decide to stay in for an evening. You can move to the next slide, please, Heather. In clinical practice, there are many examples of social isolation and the resulting loneliness. And these serve as really good models for us to understand some of the mechanisms at play behind those negative effects that we just looked at. When we consider social anxiety, depression, things like school refusal among children, these are often associated with social isolation and typically start as an adaptive function. So many times people avoid interaction to escape discomfort. So this has to do with the negative thoughts and fears that tend to lead to that self-imposed social isolation. Typically, we hear thoughts such as, I'm going to be evaluated negatively, so I'm going to sit this one out, or I'll stay home. I don't want to be interacting with others. I might look silly. I might do something wrong. And while that might work in the short term, it often leads to more difficulties. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, I want to just point out a more kind of a simple example that I think we've all experienced from time to time. And I just call it the rainy day, because if you imagine yourself in the early morning, your alarm goes off, it's kind of rainy and moody outside, and your bed feels really warm, there's a temptation to just stay put and kind of sign out for the day. And quite often, when we push ourselves to get out there and to continue with our day as planned rather than staying in bed, what I would encourage you to do, maybe the next time this happens to you, is to sort of take inventory of the number of events that you do experience that are positive. It might be just running into your local barista or saying hello to a friend, talking with your coworkers. I know I've certainly had this experience, and just being in this field, I'm aware of these mechanisms, and I think, gosh, I wouldn't have experienced that if I hadn't been here. And that's really the key of these mechanisms behind some of the emotional and psychological effects of social isolation. What we know from the research is that those seemingly adaptive withdrawals to avoid discomfort soon become maladaptive. So without social connection, without validation from others, we are left with only our own appraisals of our situation. If those appraisals are positive, wonderful. But for many people, they become a little bit skewed. And if a person has negative appraisals about themselves or the world around them, such as nobody cares about me, or for many people, beliefs surrounding the world being a dangerous place right now have been a primary thought. If nobody's around to refute these distorted thoughts, what we often see is a cycle of isolation where we end up withdrawing even more. This tends to perpetuate stigma about loneliness and some of the emotional correlates. These are all intensified, as well as those cognitive distortions, those negative thoughts that we might be having end up sort of getting stuck on a cycle if we don't have anybody else in our environment to refute them. So when we look at solutions, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this today, I want to emphasize the first thing we want to do is connect in any way that we possibly can. Even though we may not want to be relying on virtual connections right now, we can absolutely leverage technology in a situation like a global pandemic to make some meaningful connections. The Likeminded program is a great example of this, where we can really enhance those connections. We end up creating opportunities to develop new beliefs and new thoughts. We have the experience of normalization. When we're talking to other people and we realize that we're not alone, that's a really powerful moment and a powerful experience. We end up developing new thoughts, and we call this cognitive restructuring. Clinically, we often prescribe something called behavioral activation. Behavioral activation is basically recognizing that at the point of that negative thought spiral, we can't wait for a person to feel like doing something. We know that we have to employ that old mantra, just do it. Because in this situation, we know that the feeling ends up following the behavior. And so it's very important. There's a real value to just getting out there and doing it and trusting that the feeling will follow. So while connection may seem a little foreign to people as we reconnect with our colleagues and go back to the workforce, it's very important to just do it and recognize that that feeling is going to start to follow the more we engage in those behaviors. We also can't underestimate the importance of self-care and soothing behaviors in this type of very difficult situation that includes social isolation. We'll talk a little bit more about how these processes apply to our community, our healthcare workers, our patients as we move through the panel today. But I hope that this provided a good framework from which to view the importance of this topic.
Dr. Lopresti, that's very impressive, great background, and really sets the stage for us to have an excellent panel discussion. It's my pleasure to be with you all today to help moderate this panel. And just a real quick reminder of who our panelists are. We have, of course, Dr. Lopresti, who just spoke. We have Amy Herbst, who is the Vice President for Mental and Behavioral Health at Children's Hospital of Wisconsin. Dr. Munder Barakat, who's the Director of Behavioral Health Therapy at Aurora Psychiatric Hospital at Aurora, Advocate Aurora Health, and Dr. Kenneth Johnson, who's the Medical Director for Ascension, Wisconsin Behavioral Medicine. This topic is incredibly important as we focused, of course, in the beginning on the workplace, but I think our discussion today is going to talk about both at the societal level overall, as well as at the individual level. And I think that's what's impressive about our panelists. And we're going to start with our first question in the workforce, and it's going to be addressed to Amy Herbst, Dr. Barakat, and myself, who will address what kind of culture and environment are we creating today for our employees as they're working remotely, experiencing social isolation. And related to that, are there better ways for us to be proactive in addressing mental health care? And what are some of the tools that are out there that we might be able to adapt? So I'll start with you, Amy.
Thank you. Thanks for having us here today and addressing this important subject. So you've heard some of this already, actually, and Bethany certainly addressed this. In terms of culture and environment, at Children's Wisconsin, we are very much focused right now on purpose and connection. So we're always focused on that, but especially right now. So really trying to tie each individual person to our purpose, right? And connecting them to our vision and mission, but also to each other. So we're spending an incredible amount of time on that. That's actually how I started my day this morning, was with some new staff, and we connected on Zoom and introduced them to each other and really spent some time talking to them about what our North Star is and making sure they understood what their role was really related to that. So we are all about that in everything that we're doing right now. And when I think about what we could be doing as employers to proactively address mental health, I think there's a number of things that we can do. First, I would really encourage everybody to consider mental health. And it's just that, right? It's not something separate or different. Mental health is health. And it is our obligation as employers to see it that way. And if we can see mental health as health, then I think we can take it a next step in terms of our policies and our procedures and our benefits. Are our benefits in place in a way that provides the benefits from mental health the same way or in a comparable way to physical health? And taking a good look at that. And if not, then making the changes that are necessary so that our employees can say, I get benefits for mental health the same way I do for physical health because it's health. I also would say that leaders of organizations can be vulnerable in this space and show up in terms of reducing stigma and increasing access by talking about mental health, by talking about mental illness, and by doing that in the same way we might talk about somebody that has diabetes or somebody who might have cancer. Our leaders can show up and engage with our employees in a way that just says mental health is health. I'm going to talk about it that way with all of you, and I'm going to create an environment where you can do the same. And then in terms of new tools, I would say that for us, it's been all about virtual tools. So how can we capitalize on the virtual tools that we have available to us and use those in ways that allow for that connection and that connection to purpose? So we spend a lot of time on Zoom meetings, but we're doing it in very purposeful ways. So for example, with my team, we're all across the state of Wisconsin. Right there, even before the pandemic, it's easy to feel a little bit isolated when you might be outside of Milwaukee. So prior to this, we spent a lot of time driving around the states, being in person with people and connecting with them. We aren't doing so much of that right now, but we are still staying connected. So I have monthly town hall meetings with my staff, and we do that virtually. We invite everybody to those meetings. And honestly, some people have been able to get connected to people they never had before because they might be in Eau Claire and not connecting with somebody in Walworth. So a lot of it's virtual. We're using all of the great apps that have been available to us now so that we can say, please take care of yourself and use those resources as you see fit and that might be comfortable for you. And the last thing that I'll add is that it's not just about new tools. So one of the things we've reminded people of as we're doing so many Zoom meetings is don't forget to pick up the phone, right? Use that old school approach and pick up the phone and talk to somebody, not through a Zoom meeting. We used to do a lot of that, and I think that's fallen by the wayside. So let's not forget about some of what we used to do to connect with each other. That was natural and comfortable, and maybe we've fallen away from a little bit. I'll stop there because I'm sure my colleagues have plenty more to offer.
Amy, these are great practical approaches. I think that, bringing us back to the importance of connections, the human component is so critical. That's how it seems like you started. But also by showing vulnerability and talking about this, it really destigmatizes a lot of the issues that happen around mental health, social isolation, gets people comfortable talking about it. So I really like what you're talking about as a leader to model this. And I think that's why so many in the audience today are so interested in this topic, and there's a great turnout. And then finally, your stress, there's a lot of tools, the stress on use of technology, stretch that technology to its limits, and don't forget the old tools. Great starting point. Dr. Barakat, your perspectives, please, on the same issues.
Yeah, I think Amy made some wonderful points, especially with regards to thinking about mental health, the same way of thinking about medical needs or your physical well-being. And I really feel like the pandemic had pushed us to begin to think about it more that way. People are more aware of well-being, and people are asking questions about mindfulness. People are asking, what is mindfulness? How do we get ourselves to feel better? For us at Advocate Aurora, we had to switch to virtual almost overnight when COVID first hit. So team members had to work from home, even therapists working from home and interacting with their patients, where our outpatient providers would have an opportunity to interact with one another walking down the hallway, and that was just eliminated overnight. So what we did, and we're all health behavioral health providers, so we're aware of well-being, but even we can be vulnerable in that sense because we can lose sight of taking care of ourselves. So we did leverage a lot of the virtual tools. And what I did was I started team chats with each team with their own groups, so they could easily reach out when they wanted to by just sending a simple message, and they really leveraged that. So like if something comes up and they wanted to chat, they would just send out a message. Obviously, we still had our meetings and we had them virtually, but we also set up additional meetings just to socialize and connect with each other and talk about things that are happening during the week and stressors that are going on. So we're very mindful of making sure we included that socialization piece in there, because what happens when you start to work virtually is you miss out on those natural interactions that you have with team members by just walking past their office or just having those spontaneous meetings post-meeting by kind of just walking with each other to where, hey, where are you going? You know, we're going to pick up something at the kitchen really quick, and then you just walk together. All that stuff was eliminated overnight. So really, I feel like the pandemic has hurt us in some ways, but in other ways, it's caused us to really think about behavioral health and really think about well-being and start asking these questions and being mindful of it. So we continue to do these things even after. Right now, you know, we're years removed from that when it first hit, but we're starting to move more in person, but we still have those tools and those structures in place from before. And I think that's helped. And we have team members all over the state of Wisconsin and even in Illinois. So during this period of time, I've actually made stronger connections with team members in Illinois that I would have never been able to make connections with prior to the pandemic hitting, because of these virtual interactions. A team member from Illinois just sometimes just sends me a team message, say, hey, I have a question for you. I want to chat real quick. We just pop on. I said, hey, you know what? I just got done with the meeting. Let's just pop up on a comm. Now we're face to face on this virtual meeting. That would never have happened before. So now these interactions have become a foundation of how we do things at Advocate Aurora, and I think we're going to continue to do that even after, you know, as the pandemic continues, and hopefully we'll eventually be done with it in the future.
Well, thank you, Dr. Barricott. And I want to start right there, just as a quick response and kind of summary of themes that I'm hearing from you, because I think, as Dr. Raymond pointed out, if you look at what's happening in Europe, or frankly, you look at what's happening across our country, while things level off in some areas, they go forward. But we've been in this a year and a half. It's very likely we will be in this for another year, 2 years, and it may become that there's certain parts of this, especially as it relates to social isolation because of the use of technology, where we may actually continue to have these circumstances around for a long time, if not forever, the rest of many of our careers. And I've talked to many in the health profession who say, for the rest of my career, many of these issues will be with us for a long, long time. But the themes that I heard you started out talking about mindfulness and the importance of awareness of that, but particularly for self-help, self-healing, self-medication, self-care. And that's something that I think is not just in the healthcare profession, but I think for all employers and employees to recognize you're only as strong from a customer service perspective as your front line. And I think that's what's absolutely critical as I think about this in my university environment, where we're asking all of our employees to create a culture of care. We were recently recognized by the Chronicle of Higher Ed for having a very strong program around trauma-informed care, really elevating our resources and focus on that. But I also heard you talk about leveraging the tools that are available, similar to Amy. She talked about that too, but it's how we use them differently. Social chats, using them in different ways. Piggybacking, one of the things that we're doing at the university is we're trying to get individuals to end meetings early and either use that time for social engagement or just let people do what they would like to do instead of having the back-to-back, the intensity of these meetings. And as Bethany pointed out at the beginning, you can be on all day, but you can really be lonely, or you can be incredibly stressed because of the lack of compression, decompression at times. So a couple other thoughts that I'll share with you. I was asked to share a few things in terms of the university, what we're doing. We really do like to start a lot of our meetings with personal check-ins. We really like to piggyback and put some of that in. How are you? Asking that simple question. How are you? How's your family? Really, especially in one-on-one or small group meetings, spending a few minutes, making that connection, going back to what Amy talked about, the importance of that human interaction is all too remote. You know, we're so judged on efficiency, sometimes we forget about that connectedness. But I also have to tell you, what's struck me, and the timing of this panel is so spot on, because we're seeing the effects of burnout so dramatically. And I'm finding with governance groups, I'm finding with a lot of our leadership teams, if I don't acknowledge that, I've really got a tin ear to what's going on in the workplace today. It's so critical for us to acknowledge and then to also talk about tools as we are today. So we've got our EAP. Most of you do. You have your employee assistance programs. You've got a lot of professionals who can help. There's also a lot more that we have to do in terms of getting to that sense of belonging, the autonomy and flexibility, recognizing the importance of a mental health day, recognizing the importance of those types of things. But it starts with the questions about how are you doing, and recognizing and acknowledging those things. We're also trying to break away where possible from the remote environment and really try to encourage face-to-face. As the weather has turned, it's harder to do that because we've been having a lot of activities more outside, one-on-ones or small group meetings. And I can tell you, we've had a number of classroom activities where we've gone outside. A lot of rules that a year or 2 years ago would have been forbidden today are actually encouraged. So it's changing the workplace to accommodate that. Okay, next question. This one is for Dr. Lopresti and Ms. Herbst. How are you preventing burnout for your employees and the providers in your healthcare organizations? Bethany and Amy.
Yeah,
Bethany first.
Yeah, sure. It's such a great question. And I think one of the things that that's just really key at Froedtert in the medical college is emphasizing that connection. I think, building on what Amy and Dr. Barakat were just saying, without that connection, we lose some of the gratification of the workplace. And the stats were pointed out as well in the great presentation of Likeminded, that we know that if we're not satisfied in the workplace, we're going to lose good people. And so some of the suggestions that you've just brought up, I think, are just great considerations. One of the things that we're really aiming to do at FNMCW as well is really being better listeners, listening to what our staff are telling us they need. It involves that flexibility that we need. So we know that connection is important, but what does that look like for the folks who are working in our intensive care units versus maybe staff in other areas? And so we have even more formally surveyed our staff to see what is it that's working for you, what's not working for you, what are the things that are maybe bugging you a little bit about our attempts at connection, really trying to tailor our approach. And some of that is related to EAP counseling. We've tailored our approach to EAP counseling by bringing EAP counselors right on site for very quick turnaround when people are reaching out for help or connection. We have a very robust peer support program that circulates throughout, helping with debriefs in difficult situations. We know that for many of our healthcare workers, the reason that we do the work that we do it involves some level of gratification, and that has been shifted with the pandemic because we've got, for lack of a better way of putting it, we've got a lot more of the bad stuff in healthcare, and it's not as gratifying, and in fact can lead to what we term moral injury. And so we really do address that by tailoring our approach, listening to our staff, what is it that they need, and I think just the willingness to change our approach as needed has really been helpful.
Terrific. Great themes. I'm hearing listening, foundational, flexibility, changing expectations, and really through engaging, but being ready, not just to listen, but to act on what you're hearing. Great perspectives. Amy, how about you? What's happening on the children's side?
Sure. So many of the things Bethany shared, they resonate with me, and it's how we're trying to show up every day. I would describe it in two ways. We are trying to be real with people, right? People are burned out in some areas more than others. So let's just own it and be real. And we are also trying to Bethany's point, to be good listeners and to really invite the conversation and encourage that conversation. So we're really trying to stay connected to our staff in person or virtually, and saying, how are you doing? Like, last night was so tough. Are you okay today? Like, what do you need from me? Because some of our staff are going to tell us, you know what, I need to take some time off. All right, let's figure that out. How can we get that scheduled for you and cover for you while you're gone, right? So you're not worried about it and you really are taking some time off. Now, other people might say, listen, I need some time 3 mornings a week to, do my yoga class. All right, let's figure out how to make that work for you. So we're trying to keep it very personalized to people, and we're trying to own it and call it like it is, because it's real, and pretending it's not happening is not going to work for anybody. And then really trying to talk to people about what is it that works for them? What do they need from us? And how can we make that happen for you? And it's been, I will tell you, all over the board. And that's okay. That is that burden is on the leaders, and we have to own it and see how we can show up for our staff. So we've tried some things, right, that haven't really worked for many people. So, do you want to join some virtual yoga classes? Do you want to do some virtual meditation? Some people like that. Other people are saying, never, I will not do that. That's okay. That's all right. We'll try anything if it's going to help you get through this very difficult time. And so I would say it is a constant effort on our part. And we've really encouraged staff to take care of themselves and to tell us what they need from us.
Well, these are very helpful perspectives. And, as you're talking, you talked about how employees are burned out. And if we're not real, if we're not honest, if we're not doing something, it's not just listening, it's not just the platitudes, but real concrete changes. I think about the risk of not doing that. And I think that's what in part undergirds what's called the Great Resignation or the Big Quit. Pick your name and your flavor. But we're having a lot of employee turnover. We're having a lot of organizations that are shorthanded today. I go to the pharmacy this morning and they cannot handle the drive-through because of staff shortages. It's right on the window of Walgreens. You see it every day in whether it's restaurants, manufacturing, across the board. And I think the issues that you're talking about undergird this, and it really does put the onus on us. But I'm also hearing, if you say it's all over the map, this is where HR is really going to be relied upon because there are certain things that if we start treating some employees this way, others that way, this is where I think HR has got to be our best friend. Okay, next question. Dr. Johnson, I'd like to get you engaged in this conversation. So I'm going to start with you. So can you tell us about how life stages affect social isolation? And can we predict how society and the workforce will be impacted long-term due to the pandemic's forced isolation? And I'd like to just start with a quick example. We know in the college age, some things that are happening here is everything from the student who told me, I was online last year, the entire year, and I didn't make a single new friend. Now think about that as an 18 to 24-year-old. That kind of statement is really sad. And then at the other extreme, you have moms and dads telling us, I don't care what format you're in. I don't care what you do. I want Junior out of the house. You've got to get them out. So it's a family dynamic. It's a developmental dynamic. But tell me more about life stages and what you see and what your perspectives are on that, Dr. Johnson.
Thanks for having me, by the way. Wonderful, wonderful panel. I'm a clinical psychiatrist mostly, so I see lots of patients. And I also have my own children and grandchildren and aging parents. So been living through this. My perspective is that with the young adult population in my practice, separation is imperative at that stage in their life. So going off to university, the military, or getting that first job is imperative in terms of their psychological development. But with the COVID and the pandemic, that was very difficult. I had several students that I take care of who decided not to return to university because that wasn't the experience they were looking for online. Or some of my patients, with, for example, attention deficit or other problems, have a harder time using Zoom. So if you look at stages in life, you also have to remember psychiatric problems that exist. I'll be frank, some of my patients, social isolation wasn't a big problem because they're really isolated by nature given their illness. But I would say the young adult, it's really the separation that they're supposed to be having with parents in the background, the university professors there to help them. That was difficult in the pandemic. As you move into adulthood, when you have these young couples, that was a lot of strain I saw in my practice because, yeah, you could work virtually, but the children were having virtual learning. And I'd say, you know, fathers had their strain, but I think the moms in my practice had the most of it. For whatever reason, the women in my practice, it was so difficult trying to work virtually, having the children at home. I went through that with my own grandchildren. I'll spare you the details, but not easy. Plus, a lot of the child care centers being closed. Also, a lot of the adult parents had their parents to worry about. Their parents were in nursing home, assisted living, not seeing them. A lot of families I take care are people of middle to lower income. So sometimes the family would be the grandparents coming over or the older aunt coming over to do childcare. Well, during the pandemic, that was difficult to do. And you'd worry if your parents came over to help out. And I think that put tremendous strain on the adults in my practice. The older adults, I think it's another dilemma. Older adults, if you're near retirement or retired, you want to travel, right? You had a bucket list of things you wanted to do, and all of a sudden you're told you can't do those. Some older adults in my practice behave very well. Some did not behave very well. And they would want to do things, putting much strain upon their children to talk to them about not doing that. The old in my practice was probably the worst. I've been through that on a personal level with family that you couldn't visit your family. And several of my patients went through the agony of watching a loved one die in a nursing home or assisted living. A friend of mine had to look through the window as her mother was dying of COVID. Now, the nursing home will let you in, but that's a pretty scary thing for someone to go into the nursing home. It makes you want to cry. That was so difficult. So I think that, in my experience, was what I saw throughout the lifespan. The older adults not seeing their family. Can you imagine, great grandma and grandpa not being able to see the kids? A lot of people my generation were missing seeing their grandchildren. Some of us behaved better than others when it came to that. Some of us didn't behave very well. But I think that was, in summary, that's what I saw in life's changes and lifespan.
So this is really helpful, and it really shows across the different ages the significant differences. For example, at the beginning, separation not occurring with college age or 18 to 25-year-olds. The normal separation doesn't occur, but at the other extreme, separation is occurring too much, elderly adults, and so it's an interesting twist on that. But you also noted gender differences, which I think we see in the workplace all over the place, and the stunted development, and I think that's true across the board, and ultimately a lot of illnesses that may exist in a lot of individuals, whether it's mental health or others, they can be exacerbated, it sounds like. Okay.
Depression, especially with our depressed patients, wanting to be around people made such a big difference, and they couldn't be around as many people. And if you look at your older friends, as we get into our 70s and 80s, sometimes we lose friends, we lose a spouse. So what do you want to? You want to be with your family, don't you?
Yeah. I have to tell you, this reminds me of a terrible tragedy that occurred. A good friend of ours, they lost their son to suicide a few weeks ago, and he was a top medical student, top of his class, third year. And he had addiction issues, and he could not work his program. And you know what that means? He couldn't work his program because of the isolation that is so normal that it helped him out to 29 years old. It's just one of the greatest tragedies, and it's part of this phenomenon that we're talking about. So it's quite real, incredibly unfortunate. Bethany, your perspectives, particularly on the younger side of things.
And as I think Dr. Johnson made some wonderful points, I think the only thing I would add concerning younger children is, really when we're talking about the effects of social isolation on adults, we're sort of talking about it in terms of what we're missing, right? What we have known well and what we're now missing. For children, this is where they're learning, right? Social development is so important for them. And we know even that the literature tells us that children who are socially isolated for extended periods of time can have mental health effects even 20 plus years later from that social isolation, because this is the time that we learn about acceptance, we learn about attachment, we learn about love, we learn that we can make a mistake and it's still okay. And, agree too. Dr. Johnson, you mentioned that you saw this in your clinical practice as well as in your own family. And I have to say that there were some striking realizations over the last year and a half in my clinical practice as well as my family. Even had an experience where my then 4-year-old last year before bed one night said to me, "Mom, when you and Dad die, am I just going to be alone here in the house?" And it shocked me because we actually felt like we were faring pretty well, right? Both able to work from home, we were safe, we were healthy. He was well taken care of, but it really opened my eyes to the thought process of what was going on in that little mind, as his social world is developing. And so it was a very eye-opening experience. And I think it just really emphasizes the importance of social development and social connection for our younger children. That said, I do want to emphasize too, kids are very resilient. And there's a lot of research that tells us if we have one healthy adult in a child's life, that's gold, right? So we do also want to just use whatever means we can, whether it's technology or bibliotherapy, whatever we can do to connect our children, even when the environment isn't conducive. They will take off from those connections. So, yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Bethany. I'm hearing some similar themes to what Dr. Johnson said, but also some unique issues. How there is a blend that sometimes I think as employers we forget that as employees, our folks are parts of families, and that the work and life, that blend is inextricable. You cannot separate them. Somebody's only as happy or as healthy as the weakest or most unhappy or unhealthiest person in their family, and that carries into the workplace. And I think those links you made are quite good. The fact that social development norms and bonds can be disrupted a little bit are important, but also the resiliency of children, especially if they have that lifeline of one high functioning adult or person in their life. So those are some great points. Let's move on to the next question. And I'd remind our audience, this will be our last question. I'd remind our audience to put some questions in there if you have them for our panelists, and we'll open that up here after this next question. But I'm going to ask the question, particularly of Dr. Barakat, and ask other panelists if they have any thoughts on it, and then we'll open it up to everyone. Mental health is connected to many systems and challenges, including judicial systems, homelessness, workforce, education, and others. How do you see social determinants of health playing a role in healthcare? So Dr. Barakat, if you can start that, I'll add some perspectives, and then we'll open it up to our other panelists. Please, Dr. Barakat.
Thank you. It's an excellent question. I mean, we're all talking about social determinants of health more now, and recognizing the value and appreciating how multiple variables play a role in somebody's overall well-being. At Advocate Aurora, we're starting to really in how we're evaluating patients and ensure that we're considering all these variables, which include, housing issues, transportation, even recognizing that discrimination and racism plays a big role in somebody's overall well-being, access to education, the type of setting that they live in. All these variables contribute to an individual's overall well-being. And even when we move to virtual programming, we're always thinking about access, opening up access to patients, ensuring that they have access to our services. The reason why we moved virtual, obviously, is to ensure that access continued after we had to work remotely. But then you notice that still, even though we felt like access was there, and even now more patients had access because we're available virtually, we noticed that some patients still didn't have access because some of them didn't have the technology needed to access that care. So we ensured that we still had some in-person programming available to those patients, and continued our relationship with medical transportation companies that allow these patients to come to our sites to access our care. So social determinants of health is such a huge important factor to consider when you're looking at a patient. Essentially, it's looking at them in a holistic manner to ensure that we're considering every single variable that could be contributing to their overall well-being.
Well, Dr. Barricott, excellent answer, great starting point. Let me just add a couple of thoughts and then see if there are other panelists' perspectives, and then we've got some questions that are starting to come in. A lot of times I will talk about, many of you have heard me talk about the twin pillars of employment and education and how inextricably linked those two are and how foundational they are to so many other things. But I think when we look more broadly, we have to also recognize there's many other variables that come into play. And I think, Dr. Barricott, you're pointing many of those out. Issues around transportation, means to a job, or geography, issues around housing, food security, food insecurity, which is unfortunately all too challenging. But our physical environments, the safety or lack of safety, as we unfortunately see in too many places in our community. I think issues around the healthcare system, access to health, access to food, access to so many things. So these are these social determinants that are critical. I agree with you in terms of how we're approaching these issues today. I think of them at the university and how we're a Carnegie engaged university because of partnerships, and that's what you're talking about, whether it's around transportation, whether it's around nursing centers in the community. I know that at Children's, that's one of their strategies in terms of really particularly focusing on certain zip codes. And I've certainly seen Ascension, Aurora, Advocate Aurora Health, what the medical college is doing by getting away from their single or limited number of locations and really being much more accessible today. So I think these are ways that these partnerships are really spawning greater access for community health. You also talked about the racism that does exist, and I think calling that out, acknowledging how many of our systems are structurally racist, how we need to tackle that, own that, and really look at different ways of engaging and creating access. Again, the same principles we talked about earlier in terms of listening, acting differently. I also think so much of this starts with early childhood education, and I'm really pleased about efforts such as what Milwaukee Succeeds and others are doing to focus, the city of Milwaukee and others, dramatically focusing on early childhood health, early childhood education, recognizing that the tracks laid very early in life for health, for education, and for a lot of other predictors. It's dramatic how different that is. So there's a lot of different partnerships that we're engaged in. So before we brought it to other questions and answers, do any of the other panelists want to talk about social determinants and their experience, what's happening in their organizations with respect to those? Dr. Johnson, I see your hand is up.
Just going to comment, you're having I've been doing this for about 30 years, so I have a pretty large group of people I take care of. And what I noticed is people with some means in my practice, we could switch to Zoom and all this technology that Ascension provided pretty easily. But the problem is a lot of my patients have chronic mental illness, not a lot of resources. So you could just feel it every day, how hard it was to access it. Sometimes you'd have a grandchild there with a smartphone, they could talk. I just took to calling lots of my patients and chatting on the phone. When you take care of people for years, they know you and they trust you. So that was what I noticed. And just a quick phone call made a big difference. If I could encourage business leaders in any way, it would be to make sure the insurances cover virtual visits. Please don't stop that. And then also with the state of Wisconsin, make sure that people on Badger Care and state funded insurances have some access to this sort of technology. Because that's what happens in the clinical world, that these people also need care.
Great points. Okay, anything else from panelists? Okay, let's move into our questions that we've got on the Q&A. I'll start with Sister Andrea Lee's question. She's interested in thoughts about addressing these issues with senior leaders who themselves may be less willing to voice their own needs and or see themselves as anything other than the decision maker, fixer, and savior. So who would like to address that?
Well, I would be happy to say a few words there. I think that we see this phenomenon play out in a number of levels where the person who's taking care of others struggles to take care of themselves. And I think it's one of the reasons that it is so important that we have connection. And in many cases, it is that spontaneous connection when we run into a colleague and share how we're feeling, and we have that reflected back to us and normalized. And we know that, hey, this is okay. It's okay to feel this way. What I've noticed at Froedtert and the Medical College is that there are efforts to create those connections and normalizing that type of self-care behavior among our executive leaders in a more deliberate way. Getting an email from a medical director that says, hey, everybody, I was feeling really overwhelmed, and so I canceled a morning of patients to take care of myself. I don't do it often, but it wouldn't have been good care for my patients this morning, and I made sure that they were cared for, but I also need to make sure that I'm cared for. Experiences like this, I think, are so powerful. And so as much as possible, discussions like these today, just connecting and letting people know how you're doing and asking those important questions, how they're doing and what are they doing specifically to take care of themselves as well.
Thank you, Bethany. Amy, you spoke about this as well, I know, earlier in your comments. I think that was very relevant. Dr. Barricott, looked like you were about to.
Yeah, I was actually going to just, that was exactly what I was going to do. I was going to go back to a comment Amy made earlier that I really appreciate with regards to really, people aren't recognizing that you can engage in self-care and be proactive in taking care of your mental health. You don't eat healthy because you're already unhealthy. You eat healthy to maintain your health and your physical. You exercise to maintain your health. You don't wait till you have health issues, then you begin to exercise. The same thing with our mental health. We can do some things to be proactive to really build our resilience and feel good, and and getting kind of in that mindset will encourage people to really start taking care of themselves.
Terrific. Amy, put a sharp hook on this.
So, I was thinking about what Bethany was saying and thinking about how is this shown up at Children's. And what I would say is I think we've worked very hard to hold each other accountable in this space to say, yes, you are the decision maker. You are the fixer. You might see yourself as the savior. And that's exactly why you have to be vulnerable. That's exactly why you need to use your voice, right? And share your story. Because people are watching you, and that has really resonated with me and with many of our executives. We've really tried to hold each other accountable to the role that we play in the organization and to how we show up, because people are very much watching us and they're taking our lead. And it matters, especially right now, if ever before. And so I would say, I've really seen our executives team show up in a way that demonstrates this through their own actions, and it's created, a different culture and environment for us.
This is wonderful, powerful for us to be able to talk about here today. Let me just relate something. I've done a fair amount of executive coaching and leadership development in healthcare. This phenomenon that you're all describing is called the white coat phenomenon. A lot of times, where individuals who themselves are the treatment specialists, the providers, they cannot show this. They cannot have stress. They cannot be burned out. They cannot have, whether it's psychiatric or psychological problems. That's not allowed. But in reality, in the workforce, in a lot of healthcare environments, you have anywhere from 2 to 5 individuals that are clinically evaluated as needing professional help. And that was before the pandemic. And think about the challenges of medical school alone. But let's go into other workplaces and recognize that's, I think, what Sister Andrea, you're asking about. We all are in situations where as leaders, we've got to have what these 3 experts have really suggested, that ability to open the discussion up, to be vulnerable, to role model the concept of work-life balance in ways that is not just lip service, it's not just a poster on the wall, but truly own and change behaviors. Great perspectives. Thank you all. Last question that we've got, and I know we're coming up close to our time, but I think we've got time for this one. An anonymous attendee has asked, any specific considerations regarding different approaches to social isolation for those who identify as introverts or people who are neurodivergent? We'd like to start on that one. Dr. Johnson.
Well, I'm just thinking about that, and maybe those people could find outdoor activities that they would like to do. That maybe they would do that with one or two people that would be a way to bond, but maybe not as socially intense. I personally kayak. It's something I like to do. And that was something I could do with my adult children because we could keep 6 feet away. I mean, that's just one thought that pops into my mind. Or hiking in the woods, that kind of thing.
So what I'm hearing, when I think about neurodivergent individuals who are quite, there's very different approaches, very different tools and activities for different individuals. Some people might find if you're introverted, the best thing in the world to actually help with social isolation is to get a break from all the types of meetings, get a break just to be able to recharge batteries by being alone. It's that irony that Bethany, you talked about earlier, very different perspectives. And I think this question gets at those individual differences. There's not one particular approach. And that's why I really think it's important. And whether it's from the medical, psychiatric one-on-one or in the workplace, listening, trying to find what works, what doesn't work, recommending a number of different activities. That sounds like good, sound advice. Any other thoughts? Dr. Berricut, I think you were starting to move toward your mic. There we go.
I support all these because you just got to engage with the person, and the key is what kind of things did this person enjoy and engage in prior to this isolation, and remember those pieces and try to get back to doing that because it's more engaging, kind of identifying what are they missing and what do they need, and kind of getting them to get that. So there's a lot of internal kind of dialogue that needs to happen there.
Terrific. Well, I'm going to wrap things up. I'm going to turn the corner and thank all our panelists for the great job you did today. And of course, before that, all the experts and perspectives that set the stage. I do have one additional comment that came in from Liana Nakuleski about not a question, but a great set of resources from Swim Milwaukee. I encourage you to take a look at that. Click on that link. Greg, back to you. Thanks for all the work that you're doing for GMC and the community.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you for your work today, and thank you to our presenters for addressing the important topic of social isolation. Beyond that, we thank them for the continued care they're providing during a time when they themselves are undoubtedly experiencing the heavy burden of isolation. Thank you again to our earlier guest, Jeremy Froedtert. We look forward to the evolution of Likeminded and its impact on the workplace. Our next meeting is in January 2022. Happy holidays. This meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.